So I've played Kerbal Space Program a lot in the past, mostly recreating real vehicles because that's what I find to be most entertaining. But I decided one thing I've never done in this game is orbital rendezvous and docking. So I decided, whatever, I'll figure it out. So I decided to recreate Gemini 6 and Gemini 7, the first ever orbital rendezvous. But I've installed a docking adapter on the top of the Gemini capsule, which allows two Gemini spacecraft to dock when they weren't able to do it in real life, of course, because Gemini would dock with the Agena target vehicle. And before we start, yes, I know that NASA pronounced it Gemini, but I said Gemini because, number one, it's my spacecraft, and number two, it sounds cooler. So this is the crew of Gemini 1. We have Jebediah and Bill. That's the crew of Gemini 1. And my idea was I'm going to use this Titan II recreation of the Titan II GLV, which was an intercontinental ballistic missile that was repurposed to launching the Gemini spacecraft. And then I'm going to put them into orbit around 75 by 75. That is my target orbit. And now we're coming up on MECO and staging. Brilliant. I believe the Titan II did hot staging, I believe. So the second stage was reignited before stage separation, which is pretty crazy. And now we just build up tons of horizontal velocity. Now, my idea was we launch Gemini 1 with Jebediah and Bill into orbit, and then afterwards we launch Gemini 2, which is another Titan II that launches another Gemini spacecraft, and then we rendezvous with Jebediah and Bill, and we dock the two spacecraft together. Look at this. You get a beautiful view of the moon out of the window. We're not quite ready for the moon just yet because, you know, this is the Gemini program. Anyway, so we get a great view of the internals. I love the inside of the Gemini capsule. I think it looks so cool. Speaking of the inside, let's take a look at Jebediah and Bill sitting in their Gemini capsule. I assume that they're having a good time in there as the Titan II pushes the spacecraft further into orbit. Now, in real life, the Titan II would perform a single burn across the two stages, and then would put the spacecraft into an orbit. But in the KSP, or in this game, I should say, in Kerbal Space Program, it's much more efficient to shut the engine down and then perform a secondary burn at apoaps to circularize. It's just how the game works and how the physics work. Of course, in real life, you don't really know if you're going to be able to reignite this engine or not, so it's a lot better to just do it in one go. But regardless, we get ourselves into orbit and maybe make a couple of adjustments afterwards, like this. But either way, we get into orbit and we're having a good time. So look at that. Beautiful. We're in orbit now. Okay, not quite. Okay, a little bit more. Okay, now we're in a good orbit now. Yeah, look at that. Beautiful. Wonderful. So now the Gemini spacecraft is in orbit, and we're going to separate the Gemini spacecraft. So now Jebediah and Bill are in orbit, and that's the first half of the launches, because this is going to be a two-launch mission. So Gemini 1 is now in orbit. The crew it looks like they're having a good time. And now we separate the Gemini spacecraft. Wonderful. All Jebediah and Bill have to do now is wait for Valentina and Bob to come up in Gemini 2. Thankfully, we have a spare Titan II lying around. Look at this. So in real life, Gemini 6 was delayed because the Agena target vehicle, which was intended to rendezvous with Gemini, failed to orbit because the rocket exploded or something. So instead of canceling Gemini 6, there's Valentina and there's Bob, the crew of Gemini 2. They decided to delay Gemini 6 to launch with Gemini 7. Of course, 7 was supposed to stay in orbit for 2 weeks, but they changed the mission plan, so 1 week into flight, Gemini 6 would fly up, rendezvous, and then Gemini 6 would come back down in a couple of days, and 7 would complete the 2-week quota. So Gemini 1 right here is in orbit. Look at that. How beautiful. Jebediah and Bill are having a good time. And now it is time for us to send Valentina and Bob up and another Titan II that we have lying around. So we're going to wait until they're generally just over the launch pad, maybe about a quarter of the way. And now we have Titan II ignition. Those engines are running. You know, the turbo pump screeches to life. The engine ignites and we are flying. Now the Titan II is a bit slow off the pad. The thrust away is like 1.2. But the engine burns for so long. There's our roll program. Wonderful. The engine burns for so long that it gets us pretty high into the atmosphere, and the second stage takes over from there. And there's that weird camera glitch. For some reason, if you're zooming in or out and you switch cameras, it does that. I don't really know why. But let's fast forward a bit, which we're going to be doing quite a lot in this video. We're going to get some great views of the Gemini capsule with Bob and Valentina. So basically, what I'm doing is launching this into orbit, and I'm trying to match the orbit of Gemini 1. And I'm going to be making little tiny adjustments to try to draw the two spacecraft closer. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just kind of doing it by the skin of my teeth, per se. But I figure that if I tinker with it enough, maybe I'll just figure it out. And we get some great views of the moon, and there's that weird camera glitch again. But look at that. Beautiful views of the internal spacecraft, and now we have almost orbital insertion. Of course, we're going to fast forward a little bit as we wait for our orbit. I think this one was a little bit of a cleaner burn, like I didn't have to sit there and go radial in. So I noticed that my azimuth was a little off course, so I had to correct. Yeah, see, I'm trying to bring it as close as I can. But now that we're in orbit, now I immediately begin tampering with the maneuver nodes. I don't wait, I immediately do it. So we're in orbit now, and I decided to keep the upper stage of the Titan II attached for better visibility purposes, which would have been much more useful if Gemini 1 was the approaching spacecraft and not Gemini 2. But regardless, I finally managed to get an intersection right here that brings the two spacecraft within 0.01 kilometers, and then I managed to tamper with it enough to the point where it was 0.0. So this would be our rendezvous window. This is when the two spacecraft would basically come together within at least maybe, hopefully, 300 meters or so, which is about 100 feet for us Americans. So now we wait for the window. I believe I've already completed the approach burn. You see that green square right there? That's Gemini 1. That's where Jebediah and Bill are. And at this time, I was getting a little nervous. I did make a quick save, but I wanted to try to do it in one go. And for the next few minutes, you're going to be witnessing somebody who has no idea what they're doing, trying to bring the two spacecraft closer. So I'm slowing myself down, speeding myself up. I'm using the RCS thrusters in linear mode, and I'm trying as hard as I can to bring them together. Look at that. Look how close it is. Right there, I was kind of mesmerized. I'm like, oh, there it is. Look at that. How beautiful. See that? I'm pointing it out with the little stick right there. But I probably should have just been working on getting it closer. I burned the upper stage of the Titan II, which I don't know if that's a good idea, but I was doing it anyway. It probably isn't a good idea. But as you see, I'm trying to make these really quick adjustments, but the Titan II adds a lot of weight to the vehicle. I really don't know what I'm doing. You see, it's flipping all around. There's the moon right there, but I'm trying as hard as I can to get these two spacecraft closer. I switched to Gemini 1, I activate docking mode, and then I tried to target the spacecraft. If it's in target mode, it will always face towards its target, which in this case is the other Gemini spacecraft. So as you see here, I'm fiddling around. I know somebody's probably watching this thinking, oh man, you need to do this, you need to do that, but trust me, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just desperately trying as hard as I can to bring them closer. I even expend all the fuel in the upper stage and I have to ditch it, which I probably should have done to begin with. But anyway, there's the upper stage ditched. And now this leads to another obstacle, because when I try to switch back and forth between the two spacecraft, sometimes I switch to the upper stage. That's spent and just kind of debris at this point. Obviously, in real life, the Titan II upper stage would eventually decay, but this game doesn't have decays. Look at that, though. I'm finally getting them close enough to the point where I feel like, okay, cool. Now I'm controlling it enough to the point where I can comfortably begin to bring them closer. So I'm trying to go like retrograde, and I'm trying to use the RCS thrusters to push the Gemini spacecraft towards each other. Valentina's having the time of her life down there, by the way. She's really enjoying this. And I'm trying as hard as I can to bring them together before we cross the Terminator and we're in the darkness, because I don't know if they have lights. But look at this. I managed to do it. Look at that. With enough willpower, perseverance, and determination, I managed to do it, but not quite, because it's drifting further away. And at this point, I just switch back and forth and just burn the thrusters to push the spacecraft towards each other. Now watch this. I get a bit distracted. I'm fast forwarding. Oh, there it is. Oh, look how close I got. Oh, that was so close. And I completely got distracted. And I was like, dang it, it was right there. But regardless, I managed to turn the spacecraft around. And once again, I used the RCS thrusters to push them towards one another. Thankfully, the reticle on the screen, the nav ball, is really, really good at giving you a visual indicator. But eventually, after all this trial and error, I managed to bring them together. Look at this. Look at how beautiful this is. So here's Gemini 2 with Bob and Valentina. And I switched to target. And then I switched to Gemini 1 with Jebediah and Bill. And then I target the two spacecraft. So now they're always constantly going to face each other. There's a great internal view. And now I carefully bring the thrusters together. And look at this. Oh, they're rotating a little bit, but that's all right. Now watch this. Beautiful. I managed not only to rendezvous and bring the two spacecraft together, I docked them together. And as I celebrate my first ever docking in this game, I get to watch this beautiful sunset behind me. How beautiful. And thankfully, our orbit is 76 kilometers by 72. So I didn't accidentally deorbit the spacecraft trying to bring them together with the Titan II upper stage. With the thrusters, you don't really have to worry about that. But with that Titan II upper stage, I easily could have had my periaps be -2. But yes, it was wonderful. I successfully docked. It's a beautiful thing. The two spacecraft have become one. But I noticed that the windows are not properly aligned. This isn't that big of a deal, but I wanted the windows to be lined up because when I look out of the window of the Gemini spacecraft, I want to be able to see into the window of the docked Gemini spacecraft. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to undock the two spacecraft and I'm going to rotate the Gemini that's on top. I've lost track of which one it was. But I want the windows to be lined up. So here is that procedure. So I undock the two spacecraft. See right there? That's the docking port right there. So when they're undocked, I switch to Gemini 2 and I rotate it. Not with the RCS thrusters because that might push us out of the way. But I rotate the spacecraft so the windows are lined up. And look at this. We very, very gently, very carefully bring it together. I activate targeting mode and I target the docking port on the Gemini spacecraft. And I do the same for the other spacecraft. So they're both targeting one another. And then I use the RCS thrusters in linear mode to once more bring the spacecraft together. And I switched to the internal camera because I want to give you a very nice view. And look at that. There's Bob and there's Valentina. How beautiful. I don't know if this is a glitch I don't know because I was like, okay, cool. I'm going to swap to the other spacecraft so I can view through the window. But you can't view through the window. You can't. Like, the game won't let you. So I don't know if that was like a weird glitch, but it was really cool because I could see the crew. And now from the opposite perspective, we see the beautiful horizon and look at that beautiful view of the Gemini spacecraft. So how awesome. So now that the windows are aligned and I'm satisfied with that, what else am I going to do? Now that the two spacecraft are docked, now that we're in orbit, what else is there to do? And I was thinking about it. I was thinking, okay, I want to raise my orbit, or at least adjust the orbit to make it more even. Instead of being 76 by 72 kilometers, I'm going to adjust it so it's 75 by 75, or at least as close as I can get it. So we have an even orbit, because I like circular orbits. It's pretty cool. So here's me basically adjusting the orbits of the spacecraft. But I was thinking, what can I do to make this mission even more interesting, even cooler? And there's one thing that I did that I thought was so cool that's coming up. You may have already guessed what it is. Before we get to that, look at this beautiful view out of the window. From the window of Gemini, we get to see the other Gemini spacecraft and the moon out of the window. How beautiful was that, right? Unintended, by the way. So as I mentioned, though, as we complete a couple of orbits, what can I do to make this mission even more interesting? And I thought about it, and I thought, well, maybe like an EVA of some sort would be cool, but no, I really don't know what to do. Maybe I can act like I'm observing the docking ports. And then I had a realization. I can swap the crews on the two spacecraft. So Valentina and Bob, inside of Gemini 2, can physically leave their spacecraft and transfer themselves over to Gemini 1. And likewise, Jebediah and Bill, the crew of Gemini 1, can transfer into the Gemini 2 capsule. So they literally swap places. And I thought, oh man, that's crazy. I've done it again. But to tell you the truth, I really didn't know if I was going to be able to do it. Here's some great internal views of the spacecraft from the interior. There's Valentina and her crewmate Bob, and then Jebediah and Bill are together as one. So I decided I'm going to swap crews. That's going to be really, really cool. And I was thinking, what am I going to do for re-entry? Am I going to have the two spacecraft separate and then I deorbit one and then wait a little bit and then deorbit the second one? So I was thinking about that. But in the meantime, I decided it's time for us to swap crews. So let's go ahead and get the spacecraft oriented. Valentina is having the time of her life up here because she's ready to leave this spacecraft and get inside of the other one. But look at this. I make sure that the two spacecraft are oriented properly. I was going to do it like this, where they're kind of vertical from our perspective, or I guess technically they're sideways. are you sideways or upside down in space? I guess technically it doesn't really matter. But I decided, nah, you know what? I'm going to lay it flat, at least from our perspective, because I thought that would be a little bit easier. So now I'm orienting the spacecraft to prepare for the crew to transfer vehicles. And I'm like, okay, cool, here we go. Jebediah goes first because he's the commander of Gemini 1. And then I decided to have Valentina, the commander of Gemini 2, also perform an EVA. So now they're hanging from the hatch of their spacecrafts. And Valentina goes first. Oh no, she hit something. I don't know what she bumped into. But like the queen that she is, look at this, honey. Valentina managed to recover. And now she's going to bring herself to the hatch of Gemini 2 and say, well, hey, Bill. Well, hey, what's going on? Now look at this. She kind of bumps into the side a little bit, but look at that. Valentina's got it going on, okay? She went first because, you know, she's the bravest of them all, so she went first. What a queen. And now it's Jebediah's turn. There's a big empty seat next to Bob inside of the Gemini 2 capsule, which Jebediah will be filling. Once again, Jebediah bumped into something. I don't know what that was. It's perhaps related to the orientation of the spacecraft. He grabs onto the hatch, and now he enters. Beautiful. And now it's Bill and Bob's turn. So there goes Bill, and there goes Bob. Thankfully, Bob's EVA went very, very smooth. He just went up and went over there, no problem. I mean, look at this guy. He's just going around. He's coasting along. No issue whatsoever. He said, oh, hey, don't mind me, Bill, just coming across. But Bill had the most interesting. As soon as he flew, I don't know what, he just begun spinning. He begun to spin, and he kind of went wildly outside of the spacecraft's range, and then he recovered himself. I don't know what happened there. He's a little bit sideways. Maybe got a little disoriented, perhaps distracted by seeing the incredible view. But either way, he managed to recover himself, and now the crews have successfully swapped places. So now the crew of Gemini 2 launched inside of Gemini 2, and now they're inside of Gemini 1, and vice versa. Valentina had the time of her life. I mean, everybody's pretty excited. What can I say? Look at their cameras, especially Valentina. She's had the time of her life this entire mission. But now that we've successfully transferred crews, so Valentina and Bob are going to launch in Gemini 2 and return home in Gemini 1, and vice versa. Jebediah and Bill launched in Gemini 1, and they're going to come home in Gemini 2. How awesome is that, right? Now, Gemini 6A and Gemini 7 were actually going to be doing something similar to this, where Thomas Stafford of Gemini 6 wanted to perform an EVA, and him and Gemini 7 pilot Jim Lovell would swap places and they would return home in the opposite spacecrafts. However, Gemini 7 commander Frank Borman objected by saying, well, look, it would be uncomfortable because Lovell would have to wear that space suit the entire mission, so it never happened. We have some beautiful views of the interiors here. You get to see the opposite Gemini spacecraft out of the window, and the two docked spacecrafts are now preparing for descent and splashdown and re-entry and all that stuff. This is basically what our descent looks like, or our deorbit burn. We just kind of burn all the RCS thrusters retrograde because it looks like this, and you're not going to be able to see what the two spacecraft look like, so I threw in a little clip. So for descent and like re-entry, I thought, what am I going to do? I'm going to have the two spacecraft re-enter at the exact same time. So while the two spacecraft are docked together, I'm going to deorbit them. And here's the undocking of the two spacecraft. So now the spacecraft are separate. They've become two spacecraft once more. And I used the RCS thrusters in docking mode, of course, linear, to try as hard as I could to keep the two spacecraft close to each other, like relatively close. My biggest concern was that as soon as re-entry starts, they're just going to like collide with each other. So I wanted to keep them off to the side a bit. If this sounds really stupid, it's because it is. But you know what? Stupidity is a Kerbal space program tradition. But remember, it's only stupid if it does not work. Otherwise, it's genius, I guess. So now the two spacecraft were re-entering at the exact same time. I'm going to try to keep them as close as I can to one another. Now, this is the service module jettison. I faced the spacecraft retrograde, and now as we prepare to enter the upper atmosphere, I tried to jettison the service module at roughly the same time. But watch this. As we hit the tip of the atmosphere, it comes back, and it just barely nudges the Gemini capsule, and it kind of pushed it back a little bit. So now there's going to be a pretty good separation between the two spacecraft. Thankfully, it wasn't substantial enough to cause any significant separation of the two spacecraft. And now we begin to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. And I think it's awesome that we had a visual of both spacecraft the entire time. Look at that. That purple box right there, that's the other Gemini spacecraft. So we are re-entering at the exact same time. And yes, we are descending directly overhead the Kerbal Space Center. So we're returning right back where we launched. And now here's the drag chutes deploy as we cross through re-entry. Now I'm looking for the other spacecraft. I'm like, where is it? I can't see it anywhere. So here comes the main chutes. I deploy them. I look to the right. Look at that. How brilliant is that? That's the other Gemini spacecraft. And we're about 250 meters away. How brilliant is that? The two spacecraft re-entered at the same time. And now we are going to be descending on parachutes and splashing down no more than about 250 meters away. How awesome is that? So we're going to speed things up a little bit as we descend on parachutes and we prepare for splashdown and recovery. Beautiful. We splash down at roughly the same time. What an awesome mission we just had. Look at that. Here's the two spacecraft. We're going to swap back and forth. Just beautiful. And we're really close to the Kennedy Space Center, or excuse me, the Kerbal Space Center. So now we've recovered the crew of Gemini 1, which contains Valentina and Bob, who launched in Gemini 2. And now we're going to go right back over and recover the Gemini 2 capsule, which contains the Gemini 1 crew of Jebediah and Bill. What an awesome mission. This was a lot of fun.